Which means that we journalists inevitably want to ask you, who is now inside the administration, what are your relations with Peabody Coal, with ExxonMobil? How are you reaching out to them? What kind, if you are, what kind of contact is there? Do you feel yourself, as we read so often in the paper every day, at odds with these special interests, especially from the coal lobby?
Well, you know, I think one thing that Ross Gelbspan said was that initially the climate story was covered by either general reporters or, in a few cases, science reporters, but it should have been covered by investigative reporters, and that was the problem, that they should have said, okay, you know, follow the money, who's paying you to say what, and that would have been a very different story, which I think is an interesting commentary. Fast forward to today, the fossil fuel industry is not monolithic. You know, I think we've seen a significant change in how different fossil fuel companies are dealing with these issues. The Global Climate Coalition that Ross Gelbspan focused on as being the cause of much of the disinformation, British Petroleum resigned from that and said, we've seen the science, our scientists tell us it's for real, we're going to reinvent ourselves as an energy company, not a fossil fuel company. Royal Dutch Shell followed suit, resigned from that. So I think we actually are seeing the full spectrum within the fossil fuel industry. That said, you know, there's still a lot of money to be made today in perpetuating our current dependence on fossil fuels.
Are there any kind of negotiations, for lack of a better word, going on between this administration, your climate working group, and the coal people, the ExxonMobils and Peabodys?
I think much of the focus of this administration has been on working with the private sector who had begun to weigh in on the importance of addressing climate change and having some regulatory certainty. The U.S. CAP program, for example, and the other industry leaders who have been telling Congress, let's get on with some kind of cap and trade or some kind of system that gives us some better way of planning. I think it's that dialogue that has been particularly productive.
That's a very interesting, not quite direct answer. Going around. That's a nod. All right? So.
Oh, block and bridge.
Noted.
But you know, the discussion has changed in many dimensions, and I think one of the things that we're seeing now that didn't happen 10 years ago or even 5 years ago was increased engagement by young people, increased engagement by the faith-based communities that are seeing this as a moral issue. And so I think there are many more players that are engaged in the discussion now, and that is all very appropriate because in the end, I believe it really is a moral issue. But I think one of the challenges in covering climate science and in communicating it as a scientist has been the challenges that we had early on in answering the so what questions that journalists asked and that most people want to know. How will it affect me? Why should I care about this? And I think for a long time, we all thought that climate change was really important, but that it was something that was pretty far down the road, and it was something about which there were a lot of uncertainties. There still are uncertainties, but there's a lot more certainty than there was. And every time we turn around, it's happening faster and happening, the projections are worse. But one thing that I think has been pointed out is that early on, most of the focus was on trying to get people to understand the science. And that science was the physical science of how the climate system works. And it's only relatively recently have we begun to listen to the social scientists who are saying, we need to pay more attention to how people hear information, what motivates them to act on something. what kind of information is going to enable people to change their behavior? What motivates them to do something or not do something?
So it's often talked about increasingly, the psychological barriers that we're all having. There's hardly a day I don't get pulled out of denial when I read yet another study coming in, because we seem to be, as a species, by and large, wired to be as optimistic as we can. And we, journalists, developed a natural respect for scientists who we discovered have been just looking at these hard realities for a long time and getting used to them, as you have. But you're saying that there's a whole area of knowledge out there that we haven't really, the sociological understanding of how we, well, this is very interesting in a way, because you're talking about the biggest unknown. When we talk to the climate modelers and we say, what's the biggest unknown? They say it's not data about atmosphere or ice or carbon or clouds. It's what will the humans do?
Right.
And so the attention, you think, is now beginning to move towards the biggest unknown in the climate models, us.
It is indeed. And there's a whole international research program that's focused on humans, and a lot of the social scientists are telling us that the things that people need to hear before they will take action is there is agreement among scientists that it's happening. It is something that's going to affect me personally or the things that I care about. It's not unsolvable. There's something something that can be done about it, and people want to know, what can I do? And many of the social science studies suggest that unless you can address all those issues, that people just tune out and don't pay attention. And I think that's critically important. One of the other issues, though, has been, until recently, we haven't had the scientific information to document conclusively that climate change is affecting the things that people care about in their own backyards, if you will. And that's one of the reasons that this report that you know about, I think, is so important and so powerful. This was a report that was released by the federal agencies who worked together to do the analyses. NOAA was the lead agency for this report. And
this global climate change impacts in the United States.
Correct.
And the team that put that together was put together under the Bush administration.
It was.
And in fact, that should help lift it out of the false politicization of this whole issue, and released under the Obama administration.
That's correct. And it underwent intense peer review through National Academy process. A whole suite of excellent scientists reviewed it.
And 13 government agencies all gave
participated.
The people who wrote it a hard time until they gave it its approval.
Yes, they did.
Which they finally did.
Yep.
Right.
So, but I think that the reason this report is remarkable is that it's really the first time that the federal family has said that here are the ways that we can document how climate change has already affected the United States, region by region. So there are different things happening in the Southeast than the Northwest, for example, and that we can document some of those. And so the power of this is that it brings it down to the region and to specific sectors. And I think that's been a missing piece in the entire climate story. Most of our models have only been able to initially deal with the entire planet, more recently with the scale of the continent and the scale of a century. And for most people, that's just too nebulous. And we are beginning to have the models. The models are improving just at an amazing speed. And we are getting to the point where we can do some pretty reasonable models at the regional scale and beginning to do for some things on a decadal time frame.
10, 20, 30 years.
10, 20, and that is so much more. I mean, people want to know, how will climate change affect the decisions I'm making? If I'm a water manager, if in a city, if I am a farmer, if I'm a businessman that wants to build a wind farm, I don't necessarily care about 100 years down the road. I want to know about the next 2 to 3 to 10 to 20.